Hello and welcome to the Reproaction Act and Learn webinar. Tonight's topic is End the Bad Legacy, Obama. It's time for action on Helms. We are so grateful you're here. So here we are, we're your hosts. I'm Erin Matson. I am one of the co-founders and co-directors of Reproaction. Right beside me on the screen is my better half in that endeavor, and I'll give this over to her.
Thank you so much, Erin. So this is Pamela Merritt, and I am the other co-director, co-founder of Reproaction. So tonight's agenda is that we're going to introduce you in a little bit more detail than that to Reproaction. We're going to go over our commitment to abortion funding, the Helms versus Hyde versus Global Gag Rule. Then there's going to be a panel discussion that's going to cover a couple of topics. Why does Obama have an obligation to act? How does failure to act place the United States at odds with the international community? And why have faith leaders been urging Obama to act? Then we're going to go over next steps. And at the end, there'll be a Q&A with panelists or with Erin and myself. And throughout the session, if you have questions, you can type them into the GoToWebinar control panel. There's a space where you can type in your questions. We will be holding them until the end, and then I promise that we will do everything we can to get to your question before we wrap up at 7 o'clock Central, 8 o'clock Eastern. The hashtag for live tweeting tonight is Bad Legacy. We encourage folks who are on Twitter to go ahead and live tweet throughout the webinar the questions, interesting insights, or any other information that you want to share with your people about this important issue. So, who the heck are we? Reproaction is a new direct action group forming to increase access to abortion and advance reproductive justice. We're proud of our left flank analysis. We have a willingness to hold folks on all sides of the political spectrum accountable. That includes allies, people who might be identified as allies or identify as allies, and the traditional or not so traditional opposition to abortion rights. We also have a commitment to nonviolent direct action. Abortion funding for all. So Reproaction is committed to full abortion funding as a matter of basic human dignity. We support ending all abortion funding restrictions because they are discriminatory and they harm people. The Bad Legacy campaign focuses on Helms exemptions because this is an area where Obama has the personal power to act immediately.
Great. So thank you so much. So like Pamela said, one of the things that makes Reproaction, our new group, different is that we have a willingness to hold folks on all sides accountable, including people who are traditionally thought of as our allies. And unfortunately, with our Bad Legacy campaign targeting President Obama, we're calling attention to the fact that he has personal power today. In fact, he had it the day he took office to take executive action to ensure that rape victims, incest victims, and women who are on their deathbeds are granted abortion funding in U.S. foreign assistance. He has not done this, and it's shameful. So what is the Helms Amendment? We'll get into this in greater detail with our upcoming panelists, but just a couple key points that I want to lift up. First, the Helms Amendment was first enacted in 1973. It says that no foreign assistance funds may be used to pay for the performance of abortion as a method of family planning or to motivate or coerce any person to practice abortion. Now, what you see up on the screen is that we've got as a method of family planning in italics. That emphasis is something we're placing it on there because for decades, for over 40 years, The Helms Amendment has been erroneously interpreted as a total ban without exceptions for rape, incest, and life endangerment. And I think it's pretty clear, no matter how a person feels about abortion, that it's ludicrous to think of abortion in case of rape, incest, or life endangerment is using abortion as a means of family planning. We also know that these exemptions are the standard that we typically get with our U.S. Domestic policy. So again, it shouldn't be controversial at all. Obama should act. So just a brief, brief overview before we get to our panelists. Helms kills women. Almost half of the abortions in the world are unsafe, and people in developing countries are the most impacted by unsafe abortion. Each year, unsafe abortions cause 70,000 maternal deaths. That means that 1 in 8 pregnancy-related deaths worldwide is directly traceable to unsafe abortion. And those high rates of unsafe abortion are directly traceable to horrible policies that ban not just abortion funding, but abortion procedures. So we want to talk a little bit about how rape is a weapon of war. In particular, there's up on the screen, we've got a picture of Michelle Obama, our First Lady, with the Bring Back Our Girls sign. And many of us watched in horror as 234 women and girls were rescued from being kidnapped by kidnappers from Boko Haram. And at least 214 of them were found to be pregnant when they were rescued. Now, it goes to show that if we're going to have international concern and outcry, as we rightfully should, when there are these heinous gender-based kidnappings, that we need to go the full mile and make sure that these people have access to full human rights. A strict interpretation of Helms stands in the way of rape victims in war zones, which is exactly what those girls are and were, exercising their human right to abortion if they would like it. The U.S. is the largest provider of humanitarian assistance, and so the U.S. policy that we pursue sets the tone for the rest of the world. Another piece that I want to lift up in terms of rape being used as a weapon of war, here we've got on our screen, there's a New York Times article, and we've got the link there for you. ISIS enshrines a theology of rape. And it details how ISIS is very deliberately enslaving women and raping them repeatedly. And this article ends with a rapist saying, "It's not a child, it's a slave," in response to a woman begging him not to rape that child again. Again, the point of this is to lift up that we know that rape is being used as a weapon of war. There has been international outcry on this, and the least that Obama could do is extend them their human rights, as he has failed to do for the last 6 years. So I just want to quickly, as a highlight, what's the difference between the Helms Amendment, the Hyde Amendment, and the Global Gag Rule, because there's a lot of confusion about this. So the Helms Amendment, which we're discussing today, bars abortion funding in U.S. foreign assistance. The Hyde Amendment is like Helms for our domestic policy. So it bars federal funding for abortion in the United States. Both of these measures are reauthorized through the appropriations process. So that's one way to undo them, would be to have our lawmakers stop voting them in. Another piece, especially with the Hyde Amendment, there's a new bill called the Each Woman Act, which would repeal the Hyde Amendment and ensure and restore full abortion funding, both in terms of federal funding assistance as well as within private insurance plans that you couldn't bar that. The Helms Amendment is often also confused with the Global Gag Rule, which is something different as well. The Global Gag Rule barred funding to global health organizations that provide abortion services. In other words, totally gagging organizations from even making references to abortion in their education or training or referrals, much less providing abortion. And what it has done is serve to put many providers out of business. Now, the Global Gag Rule was repealed by President Obama in 2009. Interestingly, he is willing to step out there, but he simply has not done it on Helms yet. Typically, the Global Gag Rule and the status of the Global Gag Rule, which is often also referred to as the Mexico City policy, flips back and forth depending on whether there's a Democrat or a Republican in the White House. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to panelists.
Thanks so much, Erin. So this Q&A is from Beirne Roose-Snyder. Beirne Roose-Snyder is the director of Public Policy Center for Health and Gender Equity in Washington, D.C. Unfortunately, Beirne is unable to join us in person tonight, but was kind enough to provide answers to the questions that we were going to ask. So I'm going to read off these questions and then read off Beirne's response as we go along. So the first question was, why does President Obama have an obligation to act on Helms? So why is executive action important? What should Obama do? Beirne's response was, Helms has consistently been incorrectly implemented since it was first enacted in 1973. This means that the United States has never permitted foreign assistance funds to be used for abortion services for women and girls overseas who have survived rape or incest, or whose lives are endangered by pregnancy. While foreign assistance agencies, including USAID and the State Department, could rewrite their guidance and contracts to reflect correct implementation, it's clear that politically action must come from the White House. The President could issue an executive order, a presidential memorandum, or direct the agencies to write new policies. While Helms should be fully repealed by Congress, the President should act right now to ensure that the United States is doing its part to protect the health and lives of women and girls by supporting access to safe abortion in these cases. It's unclear why there is resistance from the White House. If I could change a terrible policy unilaterally to make it a little less harmful for women and girls, I certainly would. The next question is that how are rape victims in war zones particularly impacted? Beirne's response is, in many conflict settings, rape is being used as a weapon of war. While survivors ideally would get immediate medical care that includes post-exposure prophylactics to reduce the risk of HIV transmission and emergency contraception, access to care is often severely disrupted by conflict. Women and girls may be on the run, it may be unsafe to travel to the nearest health center, or health infrastructure may be broken down or overtaxed. It's critical that survivors have access to post-rape care that includes safe abortion. A woman or girl who has become pregnant as a result of rape and decides to seek abortion will often risk her health and life to terminate a pregnancy if safe abortion services are not available to her. As women try to put their lives back together in the midst of significant trauma, it's vital that they receive the mental and physical health services they need. Worldwide, about 47,000 women and girls die from unsafe abortion every year. Correct implementation of the Helms Amendment would also help women and girls whose lives are endangered by pregnancy, especially adolescent girls, for whom pregnancy can be extremely dangerous. Jacqueline Mutier, I'm probably mispronouncing that, I apologize, is the founder of Grace Agenda, a Nairobi-based organization that helps survivors access post-rape care. Shared her own story of surviving rape. Jacqueline was raped during the outbreak of violence following the 2007 elections in Kenya. She became pregnant as a result of the rape and tried 3 times to access a safe abortion, but was unable to do so. Her experience inspired her to found Grace Agenda to help ensure other women and girls get the support she was not afforded. How does the Helms Amendment impact abortion rights in countries more broadly? Beirne's response is, the U.S. government is the largest bilateral donor for foreign assistance, both in general development work and in humanitarian crises. This means that contentious policies around abortion in the United States has a very real impact on women and girls beyond our borders. There are many U.S. restrictions around women's health, and the cumulative effect is disastrous. The Helms Amendment, along with other abortion restrictions in the United States, foreign assistance, creates an environment of confusion and perpetuates a perception among service providers that engaging in any abortion-related activity, including referral and counseling, post-abortion care, even having a conversation related to abortion, will result in a loss of United States funding. USAID has also interpreted these restrictions as a ban on the purchase of certain life-saving equipment and drugs to treat postpartum complications, because they could also be used to induce abortions. As countries around the world are reforming their abortion laws, the Helms Amendment continues to provide continues to prevent United States assistance from supporting modern service provision and saving lives. This generalized fear of talking about abortion is why it's so important that the President take a public action. Even as legislative restrictions persist, we must start pushing back visibly on the notion that no United States assistance can or should pay for abortions. As Ruth Ojiambo Ochieng, Executive Director of WICCE in Uganda, said at a White House meeting and at the launch of our Break Barriers campaign in December of 2013, when the President coughs, the world listens. A little bit about an upcoming online vigil. The Center for Health and Gender Equity is hosting a global online vigil calling on President Obama to take action on Helms. It starts November 24th and runs through the full 16 days of activism against gender violence. For more information is going to be made available at breakingbarriers.org.
Wonderful. Thank you, Pamela, and thank you to Beirne. Those were very thoughtful answers. And as we move to our next panelist, we certainly can think some more about when the President coughs, the world listens. So with that, I'm going to introduce Akila Radhakrishnan, who serves as the legal director at the Global Justice Center based out of New York. Like Beirne, she has been working for years to see if we can get the United States to live up to its obligations. So thank you for joining us, Akila.
It's my pleasure, Erin.
Yes, thank you. So my first question is that the Global Justice Center has led a campaign to loosen the interpretation of the Helms Amendment and has spotlighted the funding ban as placing the United States in violation of the Geneva Convention. Could you explain this for us?
Sure. So the Global Justice Center was founded by Janet Bensha, who had formerly founded the Center for Reproductive Rights, and is also the former head of the ACLU Reproductive Freedom Project. And when we were looking at how to address this entrenched policy that for over 40 years at this point has been impacting women around the world, we decided that it would be important to look at how we can use international law as a tool to combat this. And as some of you may know, the U.S. is one of 7 countries that hasn't signed the Convention on the Rights of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. So that treaty was not an option. But one treaty that is an option, because the Helms Amendment has a deep impact on women who are raped in war zones, is the Geneva Convention. And so we looked at how it is that U.S. obligations under the Geneva Conventions, which the U.S. does in fact consider to be domestic law, are impacted by the by a strict interpretation of the convention, of the Helms Amendment, which does not allow any exceptions in the context of rape. And so for the last 6 years, GJC has been leading an international campaign that's focused not only on the U.S., but the U.S. is a major target of our action on how to ensure that women raped in war have access to abortion services. And so over the last 6 years, we've changed country-level policies in the Netherlands, in France, and in the UK. And most recently, we actually got the European Union's Commission to acknowledge that the right to abortion for women raped in war is protected by their rights to non-discriminatory medical care under the Geneva Convention. Similarly, we've also been working at the level of the UN Security Council, who in the past 3 years have issued 3 resolutions that support language that the denial of abortion is discrimination in the context of women raped in war, and the Secretary General has issued no less than 5 reports on this issue. And so our campaign has really been grounded in showing how the U.S. is violating their rights under the Geneva Conventions, because let's be honest, the U.S. doesn't take their obligations under international law seriously in any other context. And just kind of to give a little further backdrop on the Global Justice Center, one of our methodology of working is to use the law, in particular international law, as a feminist legal tool. So we have other projects looking at women in war and how the Geneva Conventions apply. And one of our goals is to make sure that as the context of war changes, as you have groups like ISIS abducting women, subjecting them to sexual slavery as a part of the aims of conflict, that the law that protects them is interpreted in a manner that is consistent with their rights and their needs.
Thank you very much. And so much food for thought in there. One thing that I want to lift up as well out of your comments is that you mentioned that CEDAW, or the Women's Treaty, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, hasn't been ratified in the United States. And that's another example of a long-standing issue. And I highlight that before moving to the next question because as a action and activism and deeply principled organization, Reproaction, it's important to note that these things that seem like they should just happen, whether it's signing onto a basic treaty that acknowledges that women are people and deserve human rights, or extending rape victims in war zones abortion funding, they don't just happen without considerable pressure. And so we are going to have to be quite loud to get things. So with that, I'll move to the next question. So the United States, as you've started to outline, has come under considerable pressure from the international community to revise its strict implementation of the Helms Amendment. You mentioned the Secretary General writing 5 reports and the like. Could you summarize a bit that process, and also let us know what the response has been to date and what we can expect in the future coming out of this international track that the Global Justice Center is pursuing?
Sure. So there's a couple of different kind of major issues. I think one is that, and it is a little bit on the extraordinary side that we've been able to get language on abortion at the level of the United Nations, because that's often an issue that is particularly fraught. But I think this has to do with 2 factors. One, the continuing and kind of the focus that exists at the international community to now recognize that sexual violence in war is not an inevitable part of conflict, but it is now becoming a strategic part of conflict. And therefore, there needs to be concerted action to mitigate and respond to this tactic or weapon of war, as many of us have described it. And so in that context, groups like the UN Security Council have determined that persistent sexual violence against women is a threat to international peace and security, and that there needs to be action. And so they're looking at what do responses mean. And as a part of this, many countries have engaged more deeply in in responding to sexual violence, or including programming on sexual violence and conflict as a part of their response to humanitarian aid. And so kind of with that context in mind, over the last 5 years, the international community has increasingly recognized the need for safe abortion services. We learned in country contexts like the war in Yugoslavia and the genocide in Rwanda that pregnancy was often a strategic outcome of sexual violence. And because of not only the physical consequences of pregnancy, but also the significant social and economic consequences of becoming pregnant from rape in many of these contexts, abortion is one of the only options that's available to help mitigate that consequence. And so over the last 6 years, the GJC has been able to help hone down the international community's attention on sexual violence and conflict to ensure that response includes abortion, because, you know, much like in the United States, in the international community, the word abortion is often a trigger. Oftentimes, even the use of the word sexual and reproductive rights is a trigger. And that's to go back to why it's been so important to ground this in the precepts of the Geneva Conventions, which guarantee women the right to non-discriminatory medical care. And what that means is that women deserve the care that is required by their condition. And in the context of women who become pregnant, that's abortion services. And on the concept of non-discrimination, I think it's very important to note that since we're talking about the U.S. here, and we haven't signed CEDAW, the U.S., the Supreme Court has found that it is not gender-based discrimination. Laws on abortion are not gender-based discrimination, rather they're related to laws on privacy. And so it's actually a very important precedent for women in the United States to have the U.S. recognize that the denial of abortion to women constitutes non-discrimination, whether under the Geneva Conventions, whether under CEDAW, which has made very clear that it constitutes prohibited discrimination, or whether under domestic law that it constitutes gender-based discrimination, not just a violation of privacy. And so in this context of building international consensus on the need to have access to abortion for women raped in war, and more importantly, that there is a rights-based approach to doing so, GJC has also been working on, with these same commitments, to create pressure on the United States government, because this policy that exists is one that has been continued by the Obama administration despite 6 years of pressure, and was continued from the Bush administration. And so what's very important here for us is that during the past 2 universal periodic reviews of the United States with the Human Rights Council, the U.S. has received a set of recommendations from various country partners, including Norway, including the UK, including France, to repeal these restrictions and at a minimum create exceptions in the context of rape, life, and incest. And unfortunately, the U.S. has not responded positively to these recommendations. This past 2 months ago, they gave a potential opening by responding positively to France's recommendation at the last UPR. But to be clear, the Obama administration has completely failed to take action on this issue, which is why we're having this conversation in the first place. And we do fully expect continued international pressure in this context. In fact, the recently issued global study on the 15 years of implementation of Security Council Resolution 1325 specifically singled out the Helms Amendment and U.S. restrictions on abortion as a significant barrier to women realizing their rights when they've been raped in conflict.
Yes, and that's a great seg to my last question to you before we get to the Q&A. And I see some questions are starting to come in, some really good ones. So please feel free to type those in the chat box, and we'll get to as many of them as possible with Akila at the end. But as you mentioned, President Obama has completely failed to take action while being under pressure for 6 years to stand up and do something. So asking you here, knowing that Reproaction is an activism-focused group, what do you think, as the strategic thought leader, what do you think activists should know, and what do you think it will take for Obama to finally stand up and do the right thing?
Sure. So I think, first of all, I want to congratulate Reproaction on the work that they're doing, because it's true. We have to hold our allies just as accountable as we hold anybody else. And I think that we've been far too nice to this administration on this issue. It's only recent that people have even started going public with the years of advocacy that's been happening behind the scenes with trying to get the Obama administration to move on this issue. This is a Democratic president. This is a pro-choice president, and yet we've had nothing out of them for 6 years. And, at a minimum, what most of the asks are for something that includes rape, life, and incest, which is consistent with domestic law, and is something that is fully doable within the executive branch without going to Congress. And I think that the really important issue for activists to know is, clearly to date, there has been no cost associated with lack of action on this issue by the Obama administration. And what it's going to get them to change is that there needs to be an actual political cost to lack of action.
Thank you very much. And again, please feel free to type in any questions for Akila. Akila, I know that we'll be back in a few minutes. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Pamela for our next panelist.
Thank you so much, Erin. So unfortunately, Reverend Harry Knox is unable to join us tonight. He's feeling under the weather. Reverend Harry Knox is President, CEO of the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice in Washington, D.C., and was kind enough to supply us with prepared remarks. So the first question was, why have faith leaders been urging Obama to act? Reverend Knox's response is, rape as a tool of war is older than the scriptures. Indeed, from my own tradition, the prophets of Israel, from Isaiah to Zechariah, and the lamentations of the people all cry out for justice and compassion for women raped in conflict. But calls for compassion are not unique to Judaism and Christianity. Commands to love of neighbor are common to many religious traditions. People of faith are compelled by our faith to act with compassion. Loving our neighbor, in this case, means making sure rape survivors have access to the care they deserve. We asked Reverend Knox, why is action important without an undermining conscience clause? Reverend Knox's response, the framers of the Constitution designed the First Amendment to be a shield to protect the individual from being forced to adopt a certain theology. There are forces who would turn that shield into a sword to bludgeon into submission anyone who disagrees with them. The decision to become a parent or not is sacred and personal, best made by a woman. Real religious liberty protects the right of a woman to make thoughtful decisions in private consultation with her doctor, family, and faith. Conscience clauses pervert religious liberty and create a stumbling block for justice. A reinterpretation of Helms should not include conscience clause because religious liberty is alive and well in this country. We asked Reverend Knox what's the job of activists. Reverend Knox's response was, this is unfortunately a political issue. The president could easily take executive action. In conversations with members of the president's administration, the thing that's currently missing is political pressure. They have heard us. They know this is a problem. They know what the solution is, but it comes down to political calculus. They need to know that not acting is going to cost them more political points than if they make a change. That's our job as advocates and activists. And I think as the president enters his final year and as the focus turns towards legacy, we must let him know that if he fails to act, the stain on his otherwise fairly positive record will not go unnoticed.
Great, and that moves back to what can you do? So the first thing we want to do is encourage you to plug into Reproaction's Bad Legacy campaign. We've got a whole mini site up for it. It's at www.badlegacy.org. There we have a number of things. We have in-depth facts about Helms. We have some shareable or some graphics that you can feel free to share on Facebook, some quotes from President Obama. And most importantly, we've got a petition there that we want to urge you all to sign, urging him to take executive action. This kind of goes back to the questions that we've asked of both Akila as well as the Reverend Harry Knox about, what is it going to take? And I think, we're hearing a resounding, unanimous conclusion that the only way that we're going to see change is if we demand change. And we have to make it more painful for the president than merely sitting back and saying, why hasn't he done something about this? We need to confront him directly with that. One thing that we have seen with this president is that he is willing and will make changes when he is pushed by activists, but that it doesn't just happen with no particular action, or hoping is not a strategy, that it needs to be public. Another thing that you can do is learn more about changes or the Center for Health and Gender Equity's online vigil in November targeting the president at breakingbarriers.org. And this is another important ask. We'll be sending out an email to all of you after this webinar. And we're very interested in knowing if there are any of you in this call who, in addition to learning more and sharing the website and taking online action, if you're interested in taking offline action in the future. We've seen that this president does respond to direct action that's been taken during the course of his administration, and we're actively looking at if that is the next best step for our Bad Legacy campaign at Reproaction. Another thing that I want to encourage you all to do is to make sure that you're signed up for our alerts at www.reproaction.org. We've also got our petition to President Obama up there. And to follow us on social media, our accounts are simply named Reproaction at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And then the last piece before we move to Q&A is to encourage all of you to save the date for our next Act and Learn webinar. We conduct these once a month. They are for the purpose of either digging deeper into topics and providing education, allowing activists to share strategies and successes with one another, giving us a space to learn from one another, offering a place to ask provocative questions and create provocative answers together. The next one is going to be a bit different than this one. We're going to be focusing on the holidays are coming, talking to all, and I mean all, of your family members about reproductive justice, because we know that with Thanksgiving and then the full-on holiday season, it's pretty common for a lot of us to find ourselves having conversations about our political beliefs. So that will be taking place on Wednesday, November 18th at 7 to 8 p.m. Eastern Time or 6 to 7 p.m. Central Time, and I expect it will be a lot of fun, so I hope as many of you as possible will join us. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Pamela to moderate the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Erin. So we do have questions. I will encourage that if anybody on the call has not put their question in, that on the GoToWebinar control panel, you simply click on the question tab and you can just type in your question and we'll get right to it. So the first question is from Morgan, and Morgan asks, do you think that with the recent election of Trudeau as Prime Minister of Canada and his promise to restore Canada's international progressive reputation, which is assumed to include increasing aid to reproductive health, will put pressure on the United States to lift Helms or for Obama or the next president to act? Akila, did you want to take that?
Sure. Well, I can give a little bit of insight. So under the Harper government, they actually put in a Helms-like prohibition on Canadian foreign funding So I think one hope, and in the past, usually I've had conversations with groups based in Canada, is that Trudeau and the new government will eliminate those. I think that it's also hopefully actions like that will put the U.S. government increasingly in an isolated position where they are the only one not committing to fund these services.
Great, thank you so much. And this next question is also for you. What do you mean by political cost? With Obama as a lame duck president, what is the political leverage? And would be interested, really keen to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I think Aaron and Pamela have both alluded to this, but this is a president who has actually changed his mind or responded to direct action and to concerted advocacy because there was something to lose for him whether it comes to LGBT issues, whether it comes to immigration issues. And I think that, more broadly, this is not a president we've held to account on really any issues related to reproductive rights. And Helms is one of the easiest things that he could do to show his commitment towards women and to show his commitment as a pro-choice and democratic president towards ensuring that women's rights, whether within the United States or whether abroad, are respected. And I think at this point, that issue hasn't been brought up. So much of the conversation these days is defined not by a true conversation on reproductive rights or abortion, but is defined by responding to the far right on these issues. And I think that it's time that we held Obama to account to a truly pro-choice perspective on this.
Thank you
and
so
this
much.
Is Erin.
Yes, go ahead, Erin.
I might jump in on that as well. We are in resounding agreement, Akila. An additional piece that I think, we're clearly with our bad legacy campaign, Reproaction has made a calculated decision that this should rightfully be linked to Obama's legacy as president. Reverend Knox also brought that up in his prepared remarks. And we know that this is a president who calls himself a pro-choice president, who says that he deeply cares about women and girls and advancing equality for women and girls. And so we should absolutely hold him accountable to that. And the fact of the matter is that with regards to reproductive rights specifically, he owes us one. Frankly, this administration, while it's done some work, and it's certainly not the far right, there are a number of areas where Obama has not shown nearly enough spine on reproductive rights to truly earn that title of a pro-choice president. For example, he has repeatedly offered several rounds of conscience clauses related to the contraceptive benefit. What we've seen is that has placated no one. You've all seen all the lawsuits and court cases, and what happens is he keeps losing more ground. Shortly after he took office, he said that we have a tradition in this town historically of not funding abortion. And again, so, reinforcing abortion funding bans. He specifically gave outgoing Speaker John Boehner, he said to him famously at one point, "John, I'll give you DC," with regards to, there was a budget deal struck in 2011 in which Obama came in and unilaterally barred DC from using its own local money, locally raised money at the state Medicaid level to help fund abortion. So, it also went directly in the face of self-governance and home rule for the District of Columbia. So this is all to say that the Obama administration, if we're going to be honest and perfectly frank about it, has not been 100% pro-choice champion, as he is sometimes painted to be. And as he looks to shore up his legacy toward women and girls, it's critical that abortion access is considered a part of that. And this Helms Amendment issue that we're asking him to take a look at with regards to rape, incest, and life endangerment is frankly a no-brainer. And we see that in political debates actually the opposition is usually painted in a corner and is stammering and embarrassed by its refusal to consider rape, incest, and life endangerment exceptions. So it should be for the president as well. And with that, I'll stop talking.
Thanks for that, both of you. So we do have a couple of more questions, and I'm actually going to combine these two because they're pretty much the same thing. Specifically, Michael asked, what is an example of offline action that activists can do to pressure the administration? And Wendy had a similar question. What specific actions are you asking people to take? Erin, do you want to take a stab at that?
Sure, and please jump on in and add more as you would like, Pamela. So the first thing, I want to make sure that everyone on this call has signed our petition to the president, and we'll share that online. That's very important. In terms of offline actions, to be perfectly blunt, we are, as we're looking to escalate our bad legacy campaign, and we do feel that escalation is what's going to help bring results, because 6 years of very concerted strategic advocacy behind the scenes has not produced a change, so this will have to be public, is that we are looking at using a more confrontational direct action boots on the ground. And so that's why we're asking, as an outcome of this webinar, if there are people who are interested in such a thing. In terms of specific tactics, we're still looking at and evaluating what might be the best tactic at the best particular time so that we get the most bang for our buck, so to speak. But if you would be interested in participating in those conversations, those organizing conversations moving forward, please do respond affirmatively to this email. And I guess just the last thing I'll say in terms of the Obama administration and what we've seen action on, having personally been there for some of the instances of LGBT service members chaining themselves to the White House fence, having been there and helping to serve as someone who was helping with a rally when we had several thousand people hug the White House over the Keystone Pipeline, I can say from personal experience that I've seen both the exhilaration and the positive power of direct action, and also on both of those issues we've seen results from the administration.
Thank you so much, Erin. I have nothing to add to that. I agree. And I'll just, of course, I have something to add, of course. But I just want to make sure everybody's aware. So you can actually respond to the email that we had originally sent out. We're also going to send a follow-up email tomorrow with this recording of this webinar. And then you can also email Erin or myself directly. It's Erin@reproaction.org or Pamela@reproaction.org. And we really would love to hear from people who are interested in being a part of the organizing discussion. And that's it for questions. So we're just going to give it another minute. If anybody has a question that they want to add in, please do so now. I'm not seeing any fly up, so I think that's it, Erin.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Akila.
Thank you so much, Akila.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much.
All right. See y'all next month.
Bye.